next, right? So along with Renaissance as a kind of style and a reemergence, and I mean again, this is so big, glossy, like the big movements. You know, I was trained in sort of a grand tradition, which is you get your classical movements, you got your medieval period, and then you get your modern period. I mean, I see the world for the last 2,500 years in three big movements. So these are big, grand statements I'm making here, kind of in that medieval period, but in that sort of medieval middle period. But what happens in the Renaissance period is a different kind of study, along with a different kind of focus in terms of subject matter, moving from science, math, and philosophy into literature, history, and oratory. We also have this thing called humanism that's bubbling up. And it's a method of learning during this period that is different from the scholastic style in the medieval. And here's the way the scholastic style worked. You raise a question, you then find a couple of people to, you know, talk about it, and you do your, this is your theme paper, right? This has been going on, this is still going on. You expound a view of several previous philosophers, and you criticize them, of course. That's the job, right? And then you get to offer your own answer to something, right? This is a method of sort of inquiry that comes out of the medieval period, and is something that we still use today in sort of an educational way, as well as a way that we learn by contrast, right? By examining what people are saying, taking pieces and parts. Good grief, this whole lecture today is all kind of the scholastic method. What happens with humanism, however, is it's more about sort of looking within and seeing the value, sort of, and being more about experience and empirical knowledge to then gain an answer to something, which is a different way of sort of looking at things, which I think is also interesting in terms of our play. It's about experience, it's about being in a body, and that in some ways is sort of matching the current thinking at the time. This has a lot of influence on the educational system in England in particular, and this sort of change of a method of learning. There are other components of humanism, however, I think that are very valuable as well for our play, such as it's an outlook that places man at the center of the universe. Now you can imagine in a world as we've been seeing, even, you know, let's talk about equivocation for a second, or Henry VIII, or any of these history plays, or any of these plays to a certain degree, situating itself with sort of, you know, Bloody Mary before Elizabeth comes on, who is Catholic, and the idea to sort of to displace God in the center of everything and put man there. You can imagine the tension that could happen between sort of a world that's really based on religion and a world that's sort of based on sort of more pagan or secular kind of world, right? So there's a healthy tension that's also being, I think, that comes out of this, well, hopefully healthy, sometimes not so healthy, I suppose, that comes out of this kind of a rise in placing man. I mean, and it's sort of Copernican in a way too, right? The guy who said that the Earth is sort of the center. It's not him. He didn't say that. What did Copernicus say? He's the one that got it right. He got it right, right?
Ptolemy.
It's
Ptolemy views.
Say again.
Ptolemy.
Yeah, right. That the Earth, that we were centered around the Earth, right? So it's just sort of interesting what the revolution that happens when you place man in the center. And so here's the humanist movement. The only source of value in the world is man, and what, of course, comes out of Hamlet's huge humanist play, right? What a piece of work is man. The goal for man includes the fulfillment of each person by the cultivation of his or her own individual nature, and with the belief in the possibility of social change. Now that sort of like popped out at me, like this is exactly what these guys think they're doing, right? In terms of cultivation of his or her own individual nature. There was a lot, it's sort of like going inward. It's an inward sort of search rather than sort of an outward one. And I think that that's an interesting sort of switch from sort of like the belief in God and all things, that I actually have some influence and effect on what I can be, to lead to our own sort of, 20th and 21st century notion of self-actualization, right? You can kind of see the sort of movement, again, in that sort of big, grand, centuries-long sort of chunk of time to get from one thing to the next. But that sort of struck me as kind of like a really interesting thing to think about in terms of motivation and sort of like where these guys are coming from in terms of why they sort of, set up this kind of outrageous, impossible task at the beginning of this play, which of course we know the minute somebody says something really stupid like, we're going to do this for 3 years, that it isn't going to happen. And lo and behold, of course, that's exactly what happens. So this leads to, and I also thought this was interesting to sort of think about in terms of Love's Labor's Lost, because what are they, you're always kind of wondering, what this guy's going to study for the next 3 years? What are they really going to be doing on their bran and water and no women and no drinking and no Martinos, what are they going to do? And of course, what comes out of the humanism movement is a new course of study called humanities, which include poetry, grammar, history, moral philosophy, and rhetoric. Now, first of all, this is probably what they're going to be studying. If they ever got there, this is what they'd be studying. And the second thing is all these elements are contained in this play. So the play is also an example of sort of a humanities, sort of like a classic humanities track. It's also about humanism. It is humanistic. It's about humanism, and it's got this sort of classic humanities track to it, which I think is kind of interesting as well. So you're like, oh, that was kind of useful to kind of know. So in other words, look, the deal is, I don't think genius exists in a vacuum. I don't think that he kind of made this all up. That actually, point of fact is, all these things were sort of circulating at the time, and other writers were also writing about them as well. Again, it's back to how he did it versus what it is. But it's just so interesting to kind of know what he could have grabbed. Now, not every play grabs this, but a lot of them do have this kind of humanism to them, and we'll see a little bit more about ballads that Marjorie Garber sort of has. She was my girl today. That kind of had a really great sort of way to sum the whole thing up.